Stalin section. Gulag, Konzentrationslager, and the absent third. Starting with the invasion, first of Poland and later of the USSR, the Nazi concentrationary universe appears to carry on and further aggravate the most tragic episodes from the history of colonial slavery. When, thanks to the trafficking of African slaves, the availability of slaves was almost unlimited, the slave owners had no economic interest at all in sparing them. They could coldly condemn them to death from overwork and replace them with others, and extract from each of them the maximum profit possible. That was how, observes a 19th century economist cited by Marx, the flourishing agriculture of the West Indies, quote, consumed millions of men of the African race. Indeed, the lives of blacks are sacrificed without any scruples. End quote. The war unleashed by Hitler in Eastern Europe represents the new and even more brutal form of the slave trade. Captured and exploited in mass, the enslaved Untermenschen, those that survived the Germanization of the territory, are forced to die from overwork, with the aim of building the civilization of the white master race and feeding its war machine. They suffer through conditions similar to those of blacks in the Caribbean, to whom, moreover, the Führer explicitly compares them. The prison system reproduces the relations of the society in which it is expressed. In the USSR, inside and outside the Gulag, we fundamentally see in action a developmentalist dictatorship that seeks to mobilize and re-educate all forces, with the purpose of overcoming secular backwardness, becoming yet more urgent due to the approaching war that, by the explicit declaration of Mein Kampf, is to be one of enslavement and annihilation. In this scenario, the terror in the USSR is combined with the emancipation of the oppressed nationalities, as well as a strong upward social mobility and with access to education, culture, and even to management and leadership positions by parts of the social strata that until that time had been totally marginalized. The pedagogical concern with production and the social mobility related to it is felt, for better or worse, even inside the Gulag. The Nazi concentrationary universe reflects, on the contrary, a racial hierarchy that characterizes the racial state, by that time established, and the racial empire to be built. In this case, the concrete behavior of those imprisoned plays an irrelevant or largely marginal role. Therefore, pedagogical concerns would make no sense. To conclude, the prisoner in the Gulag is a potential comrade, obligated to participate in particularly hard conditions in the strengthening of production inside the country, and, after 1937, they are potential citizens, though having become unclear is the line of separation from being an enemy of the people and a member of the fifth column, whose neutralization had been imposed with the approaching total war. The prisoner in the Nazi lager is firstly an Untermensch, forever marked by their nationality or racial degeneration. In seeking to find a precise analogy for the Konzentrationslager, it's necessary to bring in the concentrationary universe that profoundly marked the colonial tradition, in whose wake Hitler explicitly intended to place himself, and which targets the colonial peoples or the people of colonial origin. It's here we have the central omission of the comparison. In that sense, we can speak of the absent third in the comparison in vogue today. Two illustrious historians both defined as extermination camps the militarized work camps of colonial India of 1877, as well as the concentration camps in which the Libyans were locked up by liberal Italy. Even if one considers this classification exaggerated, the concentrationary universe of the Third Reich nonetheless reminds us of the racial logic and hierarchy that dominates the colonial empires of Italy and the West, as well as the concentration camps built by them. We are also forced to think of Nazism when we read the forms in which the, quote, Canadian Holocaust, or the final solution to our indigenous question, was perpetrated. The, quote, Commission for the Truth About the Canadian Genocide speaks of death camps of men, women, and children who are deliberately exterminated, of a system whose objective is to destroy the greatest part possible of the native people through sickness, deportation, and murder itself. To achieve this, the champions of white supremacy don't hesitate in hurting innocent children who die from beatings and torture, or after having been deliberately exposed to tuberculosis and other illnesses. Others go on to suffer forced sterilization. A small minority of collaborators will manage to survive, but only after having renounced their own language and identity, and after having been made to serve their tormentors. In this case as well, one may assume that righteous indignation may have overstated the case. Yet it remains evident that we are faced with practices identical or similar to those in force in the Third Reich, and their application arises out of a similar ideology, and that's again similar to that which presides over the construction of Hitler's racial state. Let's move on now to the southern United States. In the decades following the Civil War, black prisoners, the overwhelming majority of the prison population, often rented out to private companies, were crowded into, quote, large wheeled cages that followed the encampments of construction and railroad tycoons. Even the official reports state, beginning of long quote, that the prisoners were excessively and at times cruelly punished, that they were poorly clothed and fed, that the sick were not treated because no hospital had been provided, and they were closed in together with healthy patients. An examination done by the grand jury at the penitentiary hospital in Mississippi reported that all the patients showed signs on their bodies of the most inhumane and brutal treatment. A great many of them have broken shoulders, with sores, scars, and blisters, some with their skin cruelly ravaged from lashings. They lie there dying, and some of them on top of simple tables, so weak and emaciated that their bones were nearly visible beneath their skin, and many complained about the lack of food. Aside from this, we see living parasites crawling across their faces, and their clothes and the little they have to sleep on are ragged and often filthy. In the mining camps of Arkansas and Alabama, those sentenced to forced labor were made to work all winter without shoes, with their feet in the water for long hours. In these two states, a work system was in force, according to which a crew of 3 were obligated to extract a certain quantity of coal per day, under penalty of flagellation for the entire crew. Those condemned to forced work in Florida's Terebinth forests, with their feet bound and carrying chains around their waists, were obligated to work at a brisk pace. End of long quote. We have before us a system that makes use of chains, dogs, whips, and firearms, and that creates a living hell for the prisoners. The mortality rate is very significant. Between 1877 and 1880, during the construction of the railroads of Greenwood and Augusta, nearly 45% of the forced laborers die there, and they were youths in the prime of their lives. Another statistic can be cited from the same time period. Quote, in the first 2 years in which Alabama rented out its prisoners, nearly 20% died. In the following year, the mortality rate jumped to 35%. In the fourth year, nearly 45% died. End quote. With regard to mortality rates, a systematic statistical comparison of the concentration camps in the USSR and the Third Reich would be interesting. Regarding the Gulag, it has been calculated that at the start of the 1930s, before the clampdown provoked by the attack on Kirov and by the growing threat of war, the annual mortality rate, quote, corresponded more or less to an average of 4.8% of the camp population, End quote. That being said, the statistical data doesn't include the gold mining camps around the Kolyma River. It's also necessary to have in mind the usual underestimations from the information by health departments. However, even substantially inflating the official numbers, it seems difficult to approach the mortality rate we've just seen among African American inmates. Moreover, there's significant reason to suspect, quote, underestimations. There's the fact that, in the USSR's camps, quote, high mortality and escape rates could lead to severe punishment, that the health departments of the camps feared being accused of negligence and of being slow in achieving the patient's recovery, and that the threat of inspections loomed constantly over camp leaders. End quote. Judging by the mortality rate of the rented-out semi-slaves, it does not appear that there was a similar threat looming over the American businessmen who got rich with the construction of the Greenwood and Augusta railroad lines, or with other ventures. At any rate, we should be clear about one essential point. In the southern United States, black prisoners suffer horrible living and working conditions, and die en masse during peacetime. The state of emergency doesn't play any role, and concern with production is also either marginal or totally absent. The concentrationary universe of the southern United States reproduces the racial hierarchy and the racial state that characterizes its society as a whole. The black prisoner is neither a potential comrade nor a potential citizen. He is an Untermensch. The treatment inflicted on them by whites is the treatment that's considered normal in relation to races removed from true civilization. And again, we come across the ideology of the Third Reich. Moreover, there are eminent American historians who compare the prison system we just saw with the prison camps of Nazi Germany. And it's no coincidence that the medical experiments done to Untermenschen in Nazi Germany in the United States have been carried out using blacks as guinea pigs. Moreover, before doing it in their own territory, in the years of Wilhelm II, imperialist and colonialist Germany conducted their medical experiments in Africa at the expense of Africans. During this activity, 2 doctors distinguished themselves and later became the teachers of Joseph Mengele, who in Nazi Germany finishes the perversion of medicine and science that was already outlined in the American and European colonial tradition. Not only can one not separate the Third Reich from the history of the relations instituted by the West toward the colonial peoples and the people of colonial origin, but it must be added that the tradition continues to show signs of life well after the defeat of Hitler. In 1997, President Clinton felt obligated to ask forgiveness from the African American community. Quote, in the 1960s, more than 400 men of color from Alabama were used as human guinea pigs by the government. Those sick of syphilis were not cured because the authorities wanted to study the effects of the disease on a sample population. End quote, and end of section.